¿Listo?
Bien, buenos días. Absalón, ya estamos en este momento en transmisión en vivo, en directo a través del canal de YouTube y de Facebook del Proceso de Comunidades Negras PCN para este espacio de Afrodescendientes y la COP16.
Gracias, Darwin. Damos un saludo muy caluroso, fraternal, ancestral, desde el Pacífico colombiano. Feliz día para todas las personas que se conectan a esta transmisión de este evento tan importante que lo estamos desarrollando desde el proceso de comunidades negras con sus diferentes aliados a nivel global, pero también en coordinación con la Vicepresidencia de la República, de cara a fortalecer las capacidades, los conocimientos, las estrategias de los afrodescendientes de América Latina, del Caribe, pero también de la sexta región, de cara a las discusiones de la COP16. En este instante vamos a trabajar los temas relacionados con las secuencias digitales sobre recursos genéticos. Indicar que en ese contexto, como afrodescendientes, estamos interesados en que en esta discusión de la COP16 se puedan discutir o articular 6 temas que son sustanciales para nosotros como afrodescendientes de la región. Primero, que haya un reconocimiento expreso de la categoría afrodescendiente en los diferentes mecanismos y órganos del Convenio de Diversidad Biológica, dado que hay una invisibilidad hacia estos pueblos que tienen una territorialidad muy importante y que contribuyen de manera sustancial a la conservación de la biodiversidad y la acción climática. Segundo, que
Absalón,
puede,
disculpe un momento, una pausa que lo puede activar la cámara para que quienes nos están escuchando y nos están siguiendo eh,
ya la
puedan
activé.
ver y puedan saber con quién están interlocutando. Bien.
Listo. Y el segundo punto tiene que ver con que haya un financiamiento directo hacia los territorios afrodescendientes desde la financiación que moviliza el Convenio de Diversidad Biológica. Tercero, que haya un reconocimiento y participación directa de la mujer afrodescendiente como eje de la conservación en estos territorios. Cuarto, que se reconozcan y fortalezcan las estrategias propias de conservación que los afrodescendientes y las afrodescendientes venimos realizando en los territorios. Todo esto articulado o en clave del fortalecimiento de los conocimientos ancestrales que están en estos territorios. De igual manera que se reconozcan territorios o regiones como el Pacífico y el Caribe, que son claves para la biodiversidad y la conservación y que tienen que ser atendidas de manera sustancial en esta convención. Y por último, de que los planes de acción en biodiversidad que los países van a presentar a la convención para que puedan ser aprobados, esos planes puedan incorporar de manera clara y sustancial los intereses de los afrodescendientes en las decisiones que se van a tomar. Esa es como la agenda que tenemos nosotros planteada y hacia allá vamos trabajando, reiteramos, en articulación con diferentes organizaciones del movimiento social afrodescendiente en la región, pero también para el caso colombiano en una articulación y trabajo muy fuerte con la Vicepresidencia de la República y el Ministerio del Medio Ambiente. En ese contexto, hoy contamos con la presencia de una persona muy conocedora en el tema de secuencias digitales, que es un tema quizás muy poco conocido por la mayoría de los liderazgos afrodescendientes y que es uno de los temas que va a tener relevancia en esta agenda de la COP16. En esa dirección le damos sea necesaria al final de la sesión poder, como decía, fortalecer nuestras habilidades en estas discusiones. Gracias entonces por conectarse, por participar y le damos entonces la palabra a Presto.
Good morning. My name is Preston Hardison. I have worked at the Convention on Biological Diversity since it was being negotiated. I followed it, and then I've been attending since 1996. I've also worked at the World Intellectual Property Organization for since 2000, since it was organized. I have been tasked with being the lead on this thing called digital sequence information. I will not get into much detail over digital sequence information today. I'm going to focus on the history of the CBD and the history of the concept of genetic resources. Tomorrow, I will talk about digital sequence information in more detail. And it's important to understand that genetic resources are not exactly the same thing as digital sequence information. And it's a critical distinction to make. There's a bit of technology. I apologize for that. I will try to simplify the terms as much as possible. If you have questions at the end, I'm happy to take them. And also, I'm not going to speak to every single word on the slides. The slides should be available to you, and you can go back and try to pick up some of the details later. Next slide. Now, this is all happening under the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is all happening at the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was negotiated and completed in 1992. It's an international legally binding treaty. It entered into force in 1993 when enough parties signed on for it to be implemented and implemented. Okay, so it started in 1987 with the United Nations environmental program. They suggested there's this new term that it had been introduced by scientists called biological diversity, which is about the diversity of life at all levels of organization, from molecules to genes to landscapes, habitat, ecosystems, and catchments, watersheds, and again, at all levels of organization. So they were concerned that we were losing diversity everywhere, of diversity of all types. And we needed something more than just the general environmental statements. We needed something that focused on this new term, biological diversity, which has now been shortened to biodiversity. And the negotiations started as a pure nature conservation instrument. It had been influenced highly by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, now called the World Conservation Union, or IUCN. And IUCN had proposed this pure nature conservation. Well, at the same time that these things were happening, the Brundtland report came out. It was under the chairmanship of Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was Prime Minister of Norway for many years. And this report was exceedingly important for world affairs because it introduced people into nature. It said that the environmental issues and the nature issues were also people issues. So they were the first ones to recognize this relationship between humans and what they call nature. And they also focused on the idea of sustainable development, that what needed to be done was that biodiversity be used in a sustainable way, and the environment and other things, that all of the environment had to be treated well and cared for. Next slide. So next. So it also touches upon an older resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations on the sovereignty over natural wealth and resources made in 1952. This did not cover genetic resources, and for a long time, genetic resources have been considered as part of what's called the common heritage of mankind, or in other words, a global public domain. So nobody owned them. Anybody could use them and extract value and do research and so on, and nobody could control them. However, there was a big concern that the ones who are actually making use and making money off of genetic resources and biodiversity were the developed world, and that the South, the global South, was not getting any benefits from that. At the same time, indigenous peoples were becoming aware of genetic resources and the fact that people were taking them without permission and without sharing benefits. And so there was a lot of talk in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, about something called biopiracy, which is lack of consent for having access to genetic resources and lack of benefit sharing from getting that access. So the Convention on Biological Diversity brought genetic resources under national sovereignty control. So they said the genetic resources are belong to the nation state. And of course, the nation state can decide within its domain other entities like indigenous peoples or local communities, but it did not actually directly say that they had rights over genetic resources. So the convention was weak on that point. This is also 1992, prior to any other instrument like the United Nations Declaration. Next slide. So there are definitions of these things, and you have to be very careful, and you need to read and understand these definitions, because in a treaty, it is a general principle of treaty law that no sovereign gives up any rights, any sovereign rights, by accident, by implication. You can't just pass some language and say, oh, well, that means that they say that in order to have any constraints on your sovereignty or limitations, you have to agree to it explicitly. And so the definitions are really important because it tells you what did they agree to. And they have a very specific idea of what they agreed to. First of all, genetic resources is genetic material of actual or potential value, as defined in the CBD. So you can see it's material, and then it defines genetic material. Any material of plant, animal, microbial, or other origin containing functional units of heredity. So what that means is they were thinking about it in terms of collecting samples. Material just means you've collected seeds, you've collected pieces of a plant, you've collected body organs from an animal. And again, the CBD only covers wild, quote, wild things. That's not the indigenous understanding, but the Western idea of wild, untamed organisms. So it's not about humans, it's not about crops, it's only about these uncultivated, unbred, and quote, wild organisms. They also define something called utilization of the genetic resources. So once you have your sample, you will then use it for something. And it does not define what utilization of genetic resources is. It mentions it, but never defines it in the CBD. A later instrument developed called the Nagoya Protocol, which was finished in 2010, in Article 2 defines what utilization means. And it says conduct of research and development of genetic and or biochemical composition resources. So what they've done here is say, well, in order to get a better idea of what this is, we agree that it also includes molecules that are created by genes. So what genes do is they create molecules and proteins, enzymes that are used to construct the body and do other things. And they said those are included. So they made it very clear that those are there. Okay, next. So that's called utilization. And it's important to understand the difference between utilization and the genetic resources themselves. This is a duplicate slide. Sorry, next slide. Okay, so the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and remember this would not be necessarily applied to Afrodescendants. But it could be. I'm not a specialist on that. But in Article 31, it does state that Indigenous peoples have the right to control access to their traditional knowledge and genetic resources. The Declaration does not define genetic resources, and it draws upon the understanding from the Convention on Biological Diversity and negotiations occurring at the World Intellectual Property Organization, because the people who drafted it were also attending these venues. They were negotiators there. And so the understanding of genetic resources in the Declaration is the same as at WIPO and as at the Convention on Biological Diversity. Next slide. Now, in the convention, the primary article, there are others, but the primary article is Article 8J, which says that the parties shall respect, preserve, and maintain the knowledge, innovations, and practices of indigenous and local communities. And local communities are actually constrained. They are local communities embodying a traditional lifestyle. Traditional lifestyles relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. So what they were trying to do is not have every single group or neighborhood or community be included in this, but they wanted to include those local communities that had lifestyles very similar to indigenous peoples. And I will talk later about some issues with this that you will need to know when going into COP16, but I won't get into it here. But also notice that Article 8J really focuses on traditional knowledge, not genetic resources. So the language and the thinking of the parties at the time, and it still continues today, focuses on rights to traditional knowledge. And I'll get to the genetic resources in a second. Next slide. So we did get the phrase indigenous and local communities changed in 2014 to indigenous peoples and local communities. So that was an advance. The original language talked about approval and involvement of indigenous peoples and local communities. We have now expanded that. There is now the understanding that there is the right to what's called prior informed consent. And so prior means before you get access, and informed means that whoever you're negotiating access with has to have sufficient information to know what's going to happen with those resources and so on. And also it only addressed equitable sharing of benefits, which means the parties and the states are recognizing they need to share benefits from the ones who provide knowledge and genetic resources. But it also doesn't really think much about control over those. And there is a bit of control that you get out of a Nagoya Protocol, and I'll get to that soon. Next slide. So here's the model that they had, is that their indigenous peoples and local communities were concerned that people were coming onto their lands, waters, and territories and taking knowledge or genetic resources without their consent and without their control. There is also indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge that is circulating. It's already been published in books and articles and journals. And so it's out there and circulating around, and people were using that to do their research. So this is the model they had in their mind. The biopiracy model is somebody comes onto your land and takes your genetic resources, or that they've used knowledge they've acquired in these journals and knowledge and books and use it to develop. Next slide. So the main case is, first you start with genetic resources. And of course, indigenous peoples and local communities do not generally think in terms of resources. They think in terms of kinship and relations to beings that they are related to. They have a kinship and interrelationship to. But some scientists will come and collect a biological sample, and it will go into an institution or a university research center or into corporate research. Sometimes it generates money, sometimes it doesn't generate money. And of course, then on the right-hand side, you can't really see it. It's not got blacked out, but there are two hands. This is representing the indigenous peoples and those many local communities' visions of what biodiversity is. It's a spiritual thing that's related to them. Next slide. So again, in the model, the genetic resources were kind of left out of the picture. That was something for technologists and scientists to deal with. And traditional knowledge was viewed as a lead to useful traits. It was used just to facilitate finding.
Y científicos, en ese sentido, ya no necesita acá hacer cambios.
So I'm getting a little bleed through
De
now.
intérprete, ya se puede mantener la sala como normal.
Ah,
No necesita
Ok.
hacer cambios.
¿pueden cerrar los micrófonos, por favor?
Porque estamos haciendo la captura del...
Okay, next slide. Okay, so understanding that the way treaties work, very few treaties are what are called hard law treaties, even if they are legally binding. Most of the work actually has to be done at the national level. But they are also what are called soft law. In other words, they're trying to shape the behavior of nation states, but they're not going to send in blue helmets and police, United Nations police, to enforce this. And they also generally don't have criminal liability for failing to fulfill their obligations. So it's a way to what they do is they're really saying this is a very high level commitment. We're not going to back down on this. We're fully committed. We agree we're going to be committed. But on the other hand, it's really hard to get them to actually comply if they don't want to. And you look in the world today and we have a genocide convention and it's not being enforced. So it's very hard to actually control the sovereigns, but it does shape their behavior. And that's an important fact to know about treaties. The framework for implementing this is through national sovereignty and HA for these issues. We had a number of different decisions they realized that the Article 8J was not enough, and there's another article blocking on the reference that also refers to the genetic resources. But they realized these were not enough and they needed to develop more language. So again, the way a treaty works is you have your framework treaty, and then the treaties meet periodically, and they will add to. They can't revise the treaty itself. Again, I remind you that sovereigns do not give up their sovereignty lightly, and revising a treaty is a very big deal. But they will add new interpretations, and they will add new concepts over time. So they realized they needed to really work on this access and benefit sharing idea, that what they had in the treaty itself was not sufficient. So they started in Bratislava in 1998. They developed what are called the Bonn Guidelines in 2002, which are just voluntary guidelines. They're not binding. They established a working group to work on a more binding approach to access and benefit sharing in 2001 to 2010. That resulted in the Nagoya Protocol in 2010, which entered into force in 2014. And currently today in 2024, there are 141 ratifiers of that, I think it's 198 states or 97 states. So that's a lot. But you need a voluntary framework because many countries have not ratified the Nagoya Protocol. And also, again, as I said, these are hard to implement. Next slide. So again, the model is, and I'm sorry for that left-hand picture. I used ChatGPT to generate it. And this is what you get when you say South American indigenous. That's what ChatGPT thinks that you look like. But it just gets the idea that a researcher will come and make an agreement with a particular indigenous peoples or local community. They will then take that sample or samples they've collected back to the laboratory and work only on those samples. And then they will either develop commercial or non-commercial uses of that. But if they develop uses, then they need to share benefits. So even non-commercial uses, there's a requirement to share some kind of benefit. But in general, people are thinking more, okay, we generate money, and then we will give you some money, or we will give you something else that you negotiate with us. Next slide. So the contract is between those two parties. Traditional knowledge always requires prior informed consent. However, genetic resources will only require prior and informed consent or approval and involvement, that's the language of 8J, if the local community rights are recognized by states. So in Article 6 of the Nagoya Protocol, in paragraph 2, you can look that up and find the Spanish version. And it says that the knowledge is something that always requires prior informed consent or approval and involvement, whereas the genetic resources require that only if they have the established right to grant access. And that means that's the state that decides whether they have those established rights. Next slide. So again, it's a one-on-one negotiation based on prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms for access to traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. And genetic resources can require prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms if your country recognizes it. But it also allowed something that I've called contracting into custom. And this was a good win for local communities, because it means that you can apply your cultural, or what are also called biocultural protocols. And in those protocols, you can specify not only benefits that can be shared, but you can also say, well, you can only use it for this purpose. And if you change the use, you have to come back to us and get consent. So that was actually a good advance. And again, these are not perfect instruments, but and I'll hurry up to get done because we need to have time for questions. Okay, so even though the Nagoya Protocol encourages benefits for biodiversity, it doesn't require it. It can just be, you give us a payment. And understand, when they collect the genetic resource, it doesn't, and even using the traditional knowledge, it may not be all that valuable to them, because only 1 in 10,000 samples generally result in anything that could be commercialized. And it's also hard to measure the benefits. We have a clearinghouse mechanism. It only mentions the contracts. The contracts are private. It doesn't really show you the contracts. And most of it has come from benefits. So the point is that Nagoya Protocol has not given widespread benefits to local communities. But remember, TK may be protected anywhere. But for genetic resources,
En el hotel, esperando noticias de ustedes.
okay. If they collect genetic resources, if the states recognize genetic resources, it's only on your territories. Many of you have very wide ancestral domains, and you've been pushed into smaller places, sometimes even removed from your ancestral domain. And but most states do not recognize rights in those areas, and that's a state matter. That's not something that they can easily deal with at the international level. Next slide. DSI adds complexity, and it can't really deal with the technical issues that I'm going to talk about tomorrow at the genetic level. So it's, next slide. Fairly simple to divide bodies. If I have 100 salmon, I say you have a right to 20% of those, then I can count that. Next slide. Genetic resources, if you think of them as a sample, are fairly simple. You have your local community territory and the associated TK, and so it's fairly easy to determine, well, that sample came from that territory. So you can deal with the samples. Next slide. But when you get down to the genome level, which I will treat tomorrow, the world is very different. Because when you get away from the samples as defined in the CBD, you're talking about genes and genetic material in detail, and that's where DSI comes in. And in genetics, we moved from this model where I give you a sample, you work on only my sample, and if you find something, then I get the benefits from that. Instead, they're working with hundreds or even thousands of samples at a time. They often use samples from widely different species because they're trying to find out the functions of genes, and they need to look at what does it do in different contexts. And so they don't use this single sample. There's also this word, this long phrase, I just put it in there. It's there for you to look up. It's called CRISPR. There's now a technology that allows you to take information about genetic structure and then engineer genes. And so it ties in with synthetic biology and other issues. There are also issues arising from the World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization. These made it very complex, and I have 2 more slides and I'll be done. Next slide. So this has given rise to a whole suite of research initiatives that are called omics. And don't worry about it. It's just a Latin word. You don't have to worry about all these terms. But what it means is that it's about the study of, omics is the study of genomes, essentially different aspects of genomes, different aspects of derivatives and proteins and molecules. And this has really raced forward very highly. So if you think about indigenous peoples, local communities have known this for a long time. You think about the traditional 3 sisters system of corns, beans, and squash. It's not just a single corn plant that makes for corn production. Corn production also depends on microbes living on the leaves, microbes living in the roots. It depends on things going on in the soils, and those soils may be managed and changed and enhanced by local communities. So there's a lot of things that people do that are not just on the genetic level that improve the production of these things. Next slide and last slide. Okay, so this is where we're at now. We know that genetic resources have a definition, and they're based on samples taken from a particular place. There's also, you have to be very clear on the issue of patents and intellectual property. In most states now, you cannot patent what they call naturally occurring genes. They are called the products of nature, and people didn't create that. I'm not going to, other local communities may have different worldviews on that. But in the Western system, patents are only granted for novel, non-obvious, and inventive steps, which is you have to actually modify it, and you're not getting the patent for the gene itself. You're getting a patent for a modified gene that does not occur in nature, or you're getting a patent for technology surrounding your research genes. So a method for doing research. Also, wild biodiversity, crops and breeds, and human genes are under different regimes. So I would be very careful of trying to apply reasoning for human genes under the CBD, because as a human, when you walk out of your local community area, you still are a member of that local community, and you still have obligations to that community. When a wild, quote, wild animal or plant moves out of your territory, either by movement itself or by spreading genes through dispersal, flying, swimming, walking, it becomes very difficult then to claim property rights. And then the final note, I'm just going to make a comment about a data sovereignty. It's an important issue. It's getting, a lot of it's spreading around, but data sovereignty arose from human genetics research, and applying it to wild things that move on their own, that have their own sovereignty in a way, have their own self-determination. It doesn't really cover this issue of what happens when a species on your land moves out of your territory, or what happens when a species on the state's lands, like Colombia's lands, move onto your territory. Those are very difficult issues, and I'll cover them in more detail tomorrow when we get to digital sequence information, and I'm opening it up to questions.
Thank you, Preston. I feel that maybe a good clarification for everybody that is hearing us today is maybe in a practical sense why it is important for Afro-Colombians and others to be in the dialogue about the DSI.
Do you want me to reflect on that, Carmen?
Please.
Yes. Yes, it's very important. Again, the genetic resources, as I said, it's not clear that you have definitive rights there, and you have to work with your states to get them to recognize those rights. But even once they recognize those rights, it's going to be there are more challenges when you get to digital sequence information. And as I will mention tomorrow, this is a very tenuous decision. It was very difficult to reach because, of course, they've been doing this kind of research on digital sequences for decades now. And they have a lot of information out there already in the public domain. And they don't want anybody to interfere with their research. And so there was a first debate that said the CBD only dealt with genetic resources. And once you turn this into information, into digital sequences, which are not a physical resource, they're just information about the structure of the genome, then that's not in this regime. And we had very strong, powerful states arguing that. We were able to get the decision to say, well, you're not using biodiversity, but it is not using genetic resources, but it is a utilization of genetic resources. And utilization is a specific term that means you're using something derived from genetic resources, derived from molecules. But even so, it's it's the regime that we're putting together is not a legally binding regime. We're not going through treaty negotiations on this. And so it'll be very important for everybody, including Afro-descendants, to participate, to make sure that there is benefit sharing, and to the extent we can get some control. We're not likely to get a lot of control, but get some control over this information. You need to participate and make sure that it's used in a good way. We're not going to have I mentioned mutually agreed terms, which in a bilateral contract with a single entity, single company or researcher, you can control in detail what they do. But you can't do that here. Once it gets turned into information, and again, I'll get to the technicalities tomorrow, why the control is very difficult to make. But you can influence these outcomes, and you can make sure you get the benefits, and you can get whatever controls, and also get participation in in decisions, how the mechanism itself works for the benefit sharing mechanism. This will all become I hope, a little more understandable tomorrow when I get to the details of the mechanism.
Thanks a lot, Preston.
Entonces,
Terminó, Preston.
Sí, terminó. Adelante, Absalón.
Muchas gracias, Preston, por esta ilustración. En principio quisiera ver si alguno de los colegas que están aquí en esta sala tiene comentarios, preguntas para Preston de cara a la presentación que nos acaba de hacer. Harrison, Marley, demás colegas.
Sí, sí, Absalom. Thank you so much, Preston, for this explanation. Yo tengo algunas preguntas y unos temas que quisiera que profundizáramos. Digamos, uno de los temas de confusión acá es que muchas personas cercanas a este convenio consideran que cuando se está hablando del 8J, se está haciendo referencia también a la biodiversidad asociada al conocimiento. Tú señalabas al principio, y así entendí, que hay una diferencia. Aquí estamos hablando desde el conocimiento, las innovaciones y las prácticas, mas no está realmente linkado, asociado eso a la biodiversidad del cual surge ese conocimiento. Ese es uno de los temas que quisiera que profundizaras un poco. Dos, hay un elemento asociado, digamos, siempre se nos habla de los beneficios, de cómo se distribuyen equitativamente los beneficios derivados del uso del material genético, pero no se nos habla mucho de los riesgos del uso del material genético, de los riesgos en términos de generar nuevas bacterias, virus, y esto cómo se relaciona con la salud y la seguridad humana en un contexto donde las pandemias, los virus se convierten en un escenario, en una posibilidad real y un riesgo real para la salud humana. Eran inicialmente esos dos temas que quería señalar para ver si lo profundizamos un poco, Preston. Gracias.
Well, thank you so much for the question. It's vital. And we are addressing it in this regime. And I've said for many years, this is a failing of the CBD. Understand, HA is written in a very economic sense. It's written by Westerners who are thinking in terms of money. And their model it's a business model of the world. You give me something, and then I give you something in exchange. And so their focus, that's what benefit sharing is. But we've always said, well, you also have to look at these dangers, risks, and actual harms. And it's not just harms of the use of genetic resources, of which, as you mentioned, are many potential harms. it's also about harms coming in from other directions, and local communities are being, hurt by climate change, which they had nothing to do to create, but it's just flowing onto their territories. Pollution flows onto their territories. They had nothing to do with creating the pollution. There are all these impacts and pressures and stressors on their knowledge systems, on your on your ways of life that need to be controlled. And so if you don't control the impacts, then no amount of benefits is actually going to take care of all those impacts. I mean, you can't just say, here's a wad of money, and have fun with that, and then continue to pollute and change the climate and harm, because the erosion of traditional knowledge and the erosion of your territories is going to occur probably faster than the benefits you get. So that's a real problem. But then there are also the issues of the bad use of genetic resources. And again, I'll cover this a little bit tomorrow when we get into the discussions over digital sequence information, because we are trying to get some control over two things. One is we have the Nagoya Protocol in place. We have the CBD in place. There's a risk that the digital sequence information undermines those legal regimes. So we have to make sure that no genetic resources get turned into digital sequences unless they have prior informed consent. And the other thing is, once they get turned into digital sequence information, you won't be able to have the kind of pick and mat control. It's just, it's not there. And there's reasons I'll cover tomorrow that it can't be there in a way. But on the other hand, you can control some of these harmful uses, and we have some state support, surprisingly Japan, for example, that says, yeah, we agree that these potential harms of the use of genetic resources have to be addressed. And so we're working on that. We're, that's a difficult, because those are constraints on uses. And again, we have many, many parties that don't want any. It's actually part of the digital sequence information decision that it cannot interfere with research. So we have to put in, and we're trying to get, though, the idea that they're reasonable, and they're not necessarily just the interest of local communities or everybody's interest. It's just science has to have a license to operate, a social license to operate. And most researchers now are adopting protocols and research ethics and guidelines for their research, and including in genetics. And we're saying there has to be some guidelines and protocols and something built into the digital sequence databases. And again, I'll cover it in a little more detail tomorrow, but it's a good lead into that discussion.
Gracias, Preston. Quisiera hacer dos comentarios y luego una sugerencia para encontrar una ruta, porque entendemos de que estamos en un primer espacio de discusión sobre un tema muy complejo y quizás aquí no vamos a resolver todo, pero sí es importante que vayamos dejando puntadas sobre cómo ir resolviendo esto. El asunto es que culturalmente los pueblos afrodescendientes no tenemos tal separación de los recursos genéticos de los conocimientos tradicionales. Es una relación intrínseca entre el uno y el otro. Culturalmente así lo desarrollamos, porque la pervivencia, ¿sí? o la subsistencia de la biodiversidad depende de los conocimientos ancestrales y la cultura que se desarrolla alrededor de ese. Entonces no hay tal conocimiento. Pero el CDB y estos instrumentos sí hacen esa separación, y eso se constituye en un riesgo fundamental para nosotros, porque eso conlleva a la pérdida tanto de la biodiversidad y de los conocimientos. En ese contexto ¿hay alguna luz, un camino que uno pueda, en el marco de esta discusión, resolver ese asunto, o por lo menos dejar unas salvaguardas que le permitan a uno asegurar ese nivel de propiedad? Y lo segundo es el tema de la distribución justa y equitativa de beneficios. Eso está el título, está el titular de ese asunto. Pero los criterios y los mecanismos de esa tal distribución no son discutidos y articulados plenamente con los poseedores de esos conocimientos y esos recursos genéticos asociados. En el caso particular nuestro como afrodescendientes, mucho peor, porque ni siquiera estamos reconocidos como sujetos con voz, con derechos al interior del CDB. Entonces la cuestión sería más o menos la misma. ¿Cuáles son los caminos que en esta discusión, tanto de esta COP16 como las que vienen, podríamos ir explorando nosotros para ir superando toda esta discusión? Porque estos elementos técnicos que nos estás poniendo aquí son muy clave y nosotros los tomamos, pero sí necesitamos encontrar el mecanismo de que nosotros podamos entrar a la discusión en las decisiones para poder salvaguardar nuestros derechos asociados a estas discusiones. Gracias.
So I understand that completely, and we are it's a really difficult dance. Let me just say it again. I'll cover some of these tomorrow again. First of all, traditional knowledge is always protected. Nobody's debated that. No matter where it occurs, your traditional knowledge is protected. Although, we'll say we haven't, in terms of intellectual property, we're still working at WIPO. We're about ready to finish genetic resources, but really, it's not a good instrument. Unfortunately, it was just dominated by certain voices in the room. But in the CBD, it's very clear your traditional knowledge is yours. So the off your territory issues are not that high, although there's still significant issues. The other thing is that in terms of, let's see, what was your second question was, yeah, for the GRs, this is it's just very similar to remember when I said that first they had HA and they needed something more on access and benefit sharing. So they created the bond guidelines and they realized, well, they need something binding. So they started in on bond guidelines were meant to start the process before something binding came out, but they immediately started on creating this binding treaty of the Nagoya Protocol. When we had the bilateral approach, as in Nagoya, these issues weren't so great because, again, all those were the issues of the use and what you can do with it and all those things. That was just between you and the researcher or the company. So they didn't have to address that. But now they're going to multilateral benefit sharing, a global fund for benefit sharing. They've realized we do have to now address these issues broadly. We have to start coming up with some guidance on that. So that's what we're doing when we talk about we're pushing what's called principles of data governance, and we're saying that when you deal with these data, you have to be very careful, and there has to be rules. And so that's where we're putting our focus on trying to get some of these things in. In terms of really getting an understanding of indigenous concepts, that's going to be a longer term issue. We have Article 8J discussions going on, and it's one of the pieces of the new mandate of the Article 8J mechanism. We've proposed there be some studies and work done on local community concepts, on your concepts and your worldviews, and that we get those in front of the parties. But that's going to take a while. So what we're left with right now, we're negotiating within whatever the existing legal regimes are. And so this isn't going to happen overnight. It's going to take a while to fix these things. I'm probably not going to be here. It's going to be multi-generational. Maybe it can occur faster, and that's why you need to participate to push on it. But again, UN processes work very slowly. And this will go also to your wanting to introduce Afrodescendants. Remember, when we changed the language from indigenous and local communities to indigenous peoples and local communities, that took us 5 years to get that change. And it's very likely, in my mind, that to get a change again on the terminology is going to be very, very challenging and difficult. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but you have to realize this is not going to happen at this next meeting. It will probably rerun through the HA process and others processes, technical groups, working groups. It'll take a while, but it's worth to try to get your issues on the table, and these processes are open for you to come and promote your positions. You always have to start the dialogue somewhere, and so this is a good message to take.
Gracias, Raymond. No sé si algún colega más tiene comentarios o preguntas, pero en aras de respetar.
Solo una pequeña pregunta finalizando, qué pena.
Hágale.
Con esto último que Preston nos da diciendo, bueno, son muchos años para la inclusión de las categorías o de los términos, ¿cuáles son las recomendaciones que él nos daría a nosotros como pueblo negro, pueblo afrodescendiente, para ir haciéndolas para poder lograr esa inclusión, teniendo en cuenta todos los riesgos que pueden haber en la introducción o la recolección de material genético en nuestros territorios?
Well, this is another difficulty, and again, I'm open. It's not my business to push anybody else's positions, and every position. You're welcome. But you should be aware of the context. We are having a debate over terminology again, and the United Nations Permanent Forum has weighed in, and the UNOHCHR, the Human Rights Commission, has also weighed in slightly. And they really, there's an issue with putting local communities, indigenous peoples together. I will have to be frank, when you start adding other entities, it's going to be very difficult, because then there's a question of when do we, what other kinds of specific groupings do we need? I remind you, the term indigenous itself was hard fought. Different groups had their different ways of calling themselves. And when they came into the United Nations, they were all insisting that, no, my name has to apply. My name, the way I call myself. And in an international legal instrument, it becomes very difficult, because every name, every word you put in there will be debated. And it will cost a lot of time on the floor. And again, I'm not saying it's not worth spending that time, but it will take time. So, and if we start opening it up to all sorts of groups, then that could become problematic. So the question is, CBD, these categories aren't meant to be rigid in some ways. And local communities was actually a term that would cover a whole range of different kinds of ethnic groups and minorities and different groupings of those communities living a traditional lifestyle. But again, I'm open, it's not my business to determine that outcome, but just be aware there's likely to be a lot of contention over this proposal. And, again, I'm happy to provide advice of how to navigate that.
Muchas gracias, Preston, Carmen, a Raymond, a todo el equipo. Vamos a ir cerrando. Ya estamos sobre las 11:06 de la mañana. No queremos abusar de los tiempos de ustedes, porque sabemos de las agendas tan complejas que andan. Entonces, agradecemos, como te decía y les decía, son temas muy complejos. Todo no lo resolvemos en una primera sesión. Vamos a seguir conversando sobre este tema. Mañana tendremos una siguiente sesión. Hemos tomado nota y quizás algunos temas que quisiéramos y que hubiésemos querido hablar de hoy no pudimos. A ver si en la sesión de mañana los alcanzamos a tocar. Entonces, Raymond, demás, Carmen, Preston, Sheila, Marlene, todos aquí, muchas gracias. Damos por cerrada esta sesión en el día de hoy y nos vemos en la de mañana sobre las 10 a.m. para continuar con el tema de la agenda de mañana. Abrazos.